And joining us in studio, Marco Machona, African Democrats President, and we have Leon Lowe, a Free Market Foundation Managing Director or Executive, on the phone line. Good evening to our guests, and thanks so much for joining us. Leon, thanks for your time. Just in how South Africa is coming across the team, South Africa's Deputy President calls them, is, in your view, saying all the right things and making the right moves?
Yes. It seems quite a fantastic success, and former future President Ramaphosa, current President of ANC, seems to have done very well, and he said the right things. He didn't say any wrong things. If I am to fault him at all, and I don't just want to be one of these people who sees it as binary, or good or bad, I would fault him for what was missing from what he said he would do in South Africa, what South Africa has to do. But the things he did say, purposeful fighting of corruption, trying to what he called stabilize the state-owned enterprises, that I think is maybe a bit sort of dubious. Some of them just have to be closed down. And then the cooperation between business, labor, government and civil society, very important with a view to coming up with formulae that will generate growth. He stressed growth, growth, growth. That is important. If you have high growth, all the boats rise with the tide. And then he spoke very importantly about policy certainty. That has been a huge problem in South Africa, where policies just keep changing constantly. They don't get changed in the proper way by the legislature. They get changed by the executive, by decree. And what he should have spoken about was policy excess. The economy is just simply stifled by any number, by a deluge, a sort of diarrhea of laws and regulations. But nonetheless, policy certainty, probably he could have added policy liberalization. That is why, and this is the important thing. He said over and over again, the purpose of his visit, the reason he's there is to attract investors. Now, what you would do to attract investors is lower tax rates, liberalize the economy, get rid, for example, of exchange control, just abolish it. No sophisticated country still has exchange control. But what he said was right. What he could have added is probably the only criticism I think could be leveled at him. And the South African team, Team South Africa.
Yeah, Leon, just stay on the line. We also have Mr. Marco Machona, African Democrats President. Good evening and thanks for your time. Your initial reaction on just how Team South Africa is presenting the country in Davos.
I was listening. I was very impressed by the whole team. I listened to all the members, from the Vice President to the Minister, Rob Davis, and also Jeff Radebe. And what impressed me most was actually the division of who specializes in what, and also how they lure the investors. That was very impressive. Starting with Rob Davis, he mentioned about the one-stop shop, or the one-shop stop, whereby an investor needs to know without running around to say exactly, if I were to invest in South Africa, where do I start? And that website actually directs the investor, and also it explains to the investor exactly which portfolio the investor might be interested in. It also explains the return of the investor, because the investors also want to know, how will I get my money back? And also, if I were to be in South Africa, one of the team members actually talked about the infrastructure, that they also have about $25 billion set aside for the infrastructure. And that is very attractive to any investor to see that if I were to invest in South Africa, how can I move around? If you compare with the rest of Africa, that's a challenge in terms of infrastructure. The road system, either by air it's difficult, by road it's difficult, to access different parts of the country is difficult. So South Africa is very balanced at Davos in terms of presenting themselves to the investor.
And speaking of Africa and the delegation there, that the whole Africa, or the renaissance, the renewal, and the self-sustainability, including developing local industries that are sustainable and create employment. Do you think that voice came out as an agenda point that Africa needs to be essentially driving its own destiny?
It is, I think, between South Africa and also picking up Zimbabwe in that conversation, they went at a very interesting stage, especially the background, the political background where they're coming from. So the team South Africa went there with a lot of confidence after what happened last year in December, the ANC conference, and also the issues back home. So those are the issues the investors are more interested to see. If I were to be in South Africa, are they able to resolve their own internal issues, domestic issues? So that alone gives confidence to whoever is representing South Africa in Davos. And also, if you listen to all the team South Africa, they mentioned confidence came out a lot, that they are very confident, and also the investors are very confident to continue investment in South Africa. South Africa is not just attracting new investors. They are also in terms there to continue, to actually lure the investors to continue their presence in South Africa. So it's twofold, so that whoever is present in South Africa continues the business.
Leon, just in terms of what it means for those that are in the periphery of the economy, that are in the margins, that are still unemployment, inequality and all of that, what it means for an investor to have to consider the developmental needs and aspirations of the country, or is that another discussion altogether?
Well, let's say it's a very important issue, and by my answer, I don't want to imply any trivialization of the importance of creating opportunities for marginalized people, raising the living standards and thereby reducing the inequality of the lowest income people, creating jobs for, if I might point out that nearly 60% of young women are unemployed. It is tragic. Well over half of all young people. So that is very, very serious. However, we need to be very clear about this. No investor who goes anywhere in the world goes somewhere in the world in order to be nice to local people. They go there to make money. And what they have to do is comply with the laws. So we have to have good laws that provide investors with the confidence and opportunities they want. They don't come here because they like us. They don't go to one of 200 countries in the world because they are feeling charitable. That is not what lures investors, and Mr. Ramaphosa understands that well, and that's what came clear there. What attracts investors is a stable and secure and economically free investment environment, and what our government must do for those marginalized people is have proper policies that ensure that their standards of living are raised. And these are two separate things, and it's very easy to confuse them. One has to be very careful. If you say to an investor, come to my country because I want you to like me, the investor will say, go to hell. The investor goes to places that provide them with opportunities to invest profitably. And that doesn't mean investors don't have values and principles. Of course they do. They go to countries that they consider decent and moral. That's what we want. They go to countries that don't have corruption. They go to countries that treat their citizens fairly. Investors do have morals and ethics. But the point is they look around the world at 200 countries and they say, in which country is it best to invest?
But Leon, I think where I'm going to is the fact that how then do we improve, as you were saying, lifting the quality of life or living standards of people if all we're looking for is to perpetuate existing established business so that they can then expand their offering, distribution lines and office spaces where essentially we've seen a jobless economy or sluggish growth, and yet there is construction around us all the time, but in the main it doesn't benefit the majority. So I'm not looking for philanthropy or CSI per se. It's just how then does government translate all of this in pursuance of the investors and make sure that it also benefits the people in the main?
Oh, yes. Well, that you raised the absolutely critical question, is how do you marry these two objectives? And what you do is you say to investors, if you employ people, then we will see to it that you are handsomely rewarded for having done so. If you treat people fairly and give them, for example, housing loans as employees, and you help them to learn on the job, then you make sure the laws reward those investors. So the whole thing is to say, how do we bring about a harmony of interest between the investor and our communities who are in dire need of development? Development policy is something that our government has to be good at, And in order to do that, it must remove all restrictions from the poor. If I may say something very simple, local governments have to stop chasing street vendors and informal traders off the streets. They have to stop enforcing building codes and zoning laws that make it impossible for the poor to lift their own living standards. We need to stop harming poor people. And we can't expect investors to do that for us. We, as decent South Africans, should have policies that are good for our poor people. We should stop harming them with all this red tape and regulation and zoning laws.
Leon, just before I lose my train of thought here, we talk about entrepreneurship and the industrialization programs and also equity within these multinationals and conglomerates, that if we don't discuss the nitty-gritties at an interface or initial interaction with investors, it becomes even more difficult. So how do we expand the broad-based black economic empowerment beyond just the jobs, and ensure that people have something that they at least can give forward or bequeath to their kin?
I think the stage where South Africa is, it's at a stage where it can decide its way forward. Because if it continued just to engage investors without looking actually back home to see exactly what are the benefits, we've seen protests, actually people saying 80% or close to 90% of the wealth is actually going to the 1% of the wealth. And that's an inequality, and that's real. And you can feel it in the streets, not just in South Africa, but across Africa. But this is against a backdrop of multinational companies, against a backdrop of so many billionaires emerging even in South Africa. And then you go back to the streets, you go to look at the minimum wage, you look at the living conditions of the people who work in this corporation. And I think that is the challenge of Team South Africa when they go to Davos and say, when we go back, how do we balance? We've attracted or we've created a situation where investors continue to exist in South Africa, but how do we share? How do we distribute this wealth? How do we convince the investor to say, not just investing, but you're uplifting the lives of those who are living here? And then how do you balance? So that goes back to one of the team members that I listened to. He was talking about policies and contracts and tenders to say once the investor comes in, we need to know exactly what they're interested in. And then we come up with support structures or support programs. Those programs benefits the government in terms of communicating with the communities to see whatever has been invested in trickles to the communities, and they have to control the investment that comes. Because I think Africa, it is at a point now that we are able to sieve and sift the kind of investors that we want. We can't just take all investors to say if someone is a billionaire, is a millionaire, they are capable of investing. The question is, do we need that kind of investment? And also, can we rechannel that kind of investment so that it benefits our people? I think that is the challenge of the government at the moment.
And do you think we have that bargaining power, Leon, considering the approach we've always had towards investors, that of being treated with kid gloves? And I understand your point about tax relaxations and less government interference, but the fact of the matter is investors are also extrapolating much more in terms of value, be it the minerals and the skilled labor. You could even argue that cheap labor at that.
Yes, Cindy, there's something really very important we need to understand. If you have low economic growth, there is absolutely nothing you can do for poor and destitute people and inequality. We need to, just to give you a simple example, if you grow at 1%, which is what we're doing now, less than 1%, it takes a lifetime to double the country's wealth. If you grow at 7%, it doubles every 10 years. So, for example, had we been growing at 7%, and forget about for the time being equality, I just want to give us one simple statistic. If we'd grown at 7% per annum since 1994, our economy would now be 4 times bigger than it is, and in another 5 years or so, it would be 8 times bigger. In other words, South Africans would be amongst the wealthiest people on earth. And then you have the money to provide services and infrastructure and housing and care and education and so on. So in other words, you can't be kind to people if you don't have the wealth with which to be kind. So you've got to start, as Mr. Ramaphosa said in Davos, by having growth. That is the important thing. Once you've got growth, then you can start saying, now, how do we make sure that this prosperity is shared equitably amongst people of all races, genders, and ages.
Mr. Machona, your view in how we achieve that, particularly the strategic partners that we will then engage with. We heard with Minister of Finance, Malusi Gigaba, saying that already with SAA as the national carrier, they're looking at that particular alternative. Do you think that the shedding off of state assets is necessarily the way to go to stimulate growth and also create multiple jobs?
I think I would agree in the sense that economic growth, when you talk of figures, 1%, like you said, the growth of 1% can translate to a certain percentage in terms of wealth. But one thing that I need to clarify before I answer your question is that it doesn't necessarily mean that if an economy is growing by 4%, 5%, it translates to wealth to those on the lower scale. It doesn't necessarily mean that if you live in a country that has a consistent or consistently grow at 5% every year, GDP, then your life changes, or the way you live changes. So there is also a possibility that there's a correlation, but there's a possibility that there's no relationship in terms of your lifestyle and also the lives of those who depend on the minimum wage. So when you talk of economic growth, in this case, the national carrier, the South African Airways, to see if we can resell it or restructure and also dispose some of the national assets. I think it's more of privatization, and also what are the assets that will be left with the state. And the state will be able to manage whatever is left with, because it all boils down to the management and corruption. Whatever little the state might be left with doesn't necessarily mean that they're able or they can afford to manage. So, and also when you offload some of the assets to the public or to the private, will the people in the private sector be able to manage those assets, and also how will they benefit the people who are in the communities?
Your response, Leon, and just that, to sell the idea of higher economic outlook or forecast and numbers, if we're in the double digits it would have been great, but what does it mean in creating employment, and have we cite some examples, if you will, of a higher economic growth outlook that has translated in more job opportunities?
Oh yes. I think our unemployment is such an unbelievable tragedy that we should declare a state of emergency. I just am amazed that we can sit here with the world's highest enduring unemployment rate and be so calm about it. It's catastrophic. So what we look at is the countries in which jobs have been created, in which the living standards of the lowest income people have been raised, and those countries are, for example, China and India are very famous examples, but we have some very good examples in Africa: Rwanda, Mauritius, Ghana, Uganda. So we have, and in fact our neighbor Botswana, and even now more recently Mozambique, are achieving really very impressive performance. In fact, Africa generally is now the highest growth region in the world, or sub-Saharan Africa, what we used to call Black Africa. So Africa is now actually doing very well for the poor, which is very important. So we in South Africa, we don't have to reinvent anything. We simply have to see in the countries in which equality is improving, the living standards of the poor are rising, jobs are being created for the unemployed, and there's high rates of economic growth, what do those countries do? And that's quite straightforward. It's very simple. To put it bluntly, they adopt, I'm sorry to use this forbidden term, neoliberal economic policies. And when China and India and Mauritius and Rwanda and countries around us in Africa, Botswana, Mozambique, Tanzania, do this, they achieve exactly what you want. So that's really what we have to do. It's really not very complicated. And we unfortunately have some ideological blind spots that make it difficult for us. And I think even made it difficult for Mr. Ramaphosa and Vos to really spell it out, although I have no doubt...
By that, I suppose you're referring to radical socio-economic transformation, Leon?
Yes, we need to radically transform the economy by everything that has been set up to now, what's meant by radical economic transformation, is not radical. It's not economic, and it's not transformative.
All right, so Leon, I just need to give Mr. Machona the final word. Thanks indeed for your time. Leon Low, Free Market Foundation Managing Director. Very briefly, in that, where's the discussion around the emphasis of intertrade in Africa and growing local and uniquely African industries to compete or to have that competitive edge?
I think that's a very important question, because what we see in Africa are the same players which are very dominant in, let's say, in South African economy. If you cross over the borders, you find that the same companies exist. If it's MTN, if it's Standard Bank, if it's ShopRite, if it's SPAR. So you find that these are the same companies which are finding themselves across Africa. So it is still very difficult for entrepreneurs, especially blacks, to penetrate, because these also the supply chain, they also form cartels in terms of those who supply those shops or those chain of stores, if I were to give shops as an example. So for anybody, even if you are in South Africa, to penetrate is very difficult. You go to Zimbabwe, find that the setup is duplicating itself. And so for an entrepreneur who is of African origin, it's becoming very, very difficult. But we hear these numbers of how good Africa is doing, how the growth are. But when you go back down the ladder, you find that it's not really benefiting us.
And how will your party, African Democrats, offer an alternative to the Zimbabwean people?
For us, just quickly, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is the title deeds in the rural areas, because I think we find that to us Africans, we do have land in the rural areas, but it has no title deeds. So it's very difficult to wage it against borrowing to the bank, because you do have lots of land, but it's of no value if it doesn't have title deeds.
All right,
so
we'll have you in next time with your manifesto. But Marco Machona, thank you so much for your time. That's African Democrats President joining us in studio. We'll take a quick break. We'll see you shortly.